There is a village in Kazakhstan called Kalachi. It sits on flat, dry steppe land, surrounded by nothing in particular. A few hundred people, some old Soviet-era houses, a school, a shop, a clinic. The kind of place that exists in thousands of versions across the former Soviet Union, unremarkable in every way, forgotten by the rest of the world. Or it was, until people started falling asleep and no one could explain why. Not tired, not drowsy, asleep. Suddenly, completely, without warning, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of walking down a road, in the middle of eating lunch, they would simply stop wherever they were and fall into a sleep so deep that nothing could wake them. Not shouting, not shaking, not cold water, nothing. Some slept for 2 days, some for 3. One man slept for 6 days straight, and when they woke up, many of them could not remember who they were. The first recorded episode happened in the spring of 2010. A handful of residents collapsed on the same day, within hours of each other. The local clinic had no explanation. They treated it as individual cases, exhaustion perhaps, or some kind of virus moving through the community. The patients recovered. Life returned to normal. And for a while, everyone tried to forget it had happened. But it happened again. In the spring of 2012, another wave swept through Kalachi. More people this time. An entire classroom of children fell asleep at their desks mid-lesson. The teacher tried to wake them. She could not. She ran to the school director. By the time help arrived, several adults in the building had also collapsed. Ambulances came from the nearest city, Isil, 2 hours away. Doctors arrived and found something that made no medical sense. The patients were deeply unconscious, breathing normally, with stable vital signs, completely unreachable. One child, a girl of about 8, woke up 3 days later and told her mother she had dreamed about horses. She said it was the most beautiful dream she had ever had. She said she hadn't wanted to wake up. The authorities sent investigators. The investigators sent samples, water, soil, air, to laboratories in the capital. The laboratories found nothing unusual. No known toxin, no bacteria, no virus, no gas. The water was clean. The soil was normal. The air tested the same as any other steppe town. The government declared there was no cause for alarm. The sleeping continued. By 2013, nearly a quarter of Kalachi's population had been affected at least once. Some residents had collapsed multiple times. There were people in the village who had fallen asleep unexpectedly 4, 5, 6 times over the course of 3 years. A man named Pavel Patakin told journalists that he had been walking to his garage when everything went dark. He woke up in a hospital 2 days later. He said the last thing he remembered was noticing that the light looked strange, too bright, slightly yellow, like light through smoke, though there was no smoke. Others reported the same thing before losing consciousness. A strange quality to the light, a feeling of warmth in the chest, a sound like wind even when the air was still, and then nothing. Doctors began to notice something else, the hallucinations. Not everyone had them, but many did. Vivid, intensely detailed experiences during the sleep that felt more real than waking life. One elderly woman said she had spent her entire 3-day sleep in her childhood village, walking through streets she hadn't seen in 60 years. She said she could smell the bread from the bakery. She woke up weeping because she hadn't wanted to leave. A middle-aged man reported something different. He said that during his sleep, he saw creatures in his room. Not frightening. He was careful to say that. Just present, watching. He said they seemed curious about him. When he tried to describe them, he stopped and shook his head and said there were no words. His wife, who had been sitting beside him the entire time he slept, said the room had been completely empty. Scientists and journalists began arriving in Kalachi from around the world. A BBC crew came, a team from a Russian scientific institute, independent researchers from several universities. They all measured the same things: air, water, soil, radiation levels, electromagnetic fields. They all found the same thing. Nothing. Or almost nothing. One research team, digging deeper into the history of the area, found something interesting. About 2 kilometers from Kalachi, half buried in the steppe, was an old uranium mine. It had operated during the Soviet era, extracting ore throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the mine was simply abandoned, sealed but not properly decommissioned, left to slowly deteriorate in the middle of the steppe. The researchers proposed a theory. As the mine's tunnels and chambers aged and shifted, pockets of carbon monoxide and radon gas, both natural byproducts of uranium ore decomposition, might be seeping upward through the ground, accumulating in low-lying areas of the village, particularly during certain wind conditions and seasons. This would explain, they said, why the episodes seemed to cluster in spring when the ground thaws and gases that have been trapped all winter begin to move. It would explain why some parts of the village were more affected than others, and it would explain the hallucinations. Both carbon monoxide and radon in certain concentrations can cause vivid, dreamlike neurological states before causing unconsciousness. It was a reasonable theory, scientific, logical. There was only one problem. The measurements never confirmed it. In the moments during active sleeping episodes, when residents were collapsing and the village clinic was filling up, researchers rushed to take readings. The gas levels in the air were not elevated, not significantly, not in ways that should have caused mass unconsciousness. The numbers were always just slightly above normal, never anywhere near the thresholds required to drop a human being in their tracks. The theory explained everything except the scale of what was actually happening. In 2014, the Kazakhstani government made a decision. Rather than continuing to investigate a mystery it could not solve, it began relocating the residents of Kalachi to other towns. Quietly, without much official explanation, the village was effectively emptied. By 2016, only a handful of stubborn residents remained, mostly elderly people who had lived their whole lives in Kalachi and refused to leave, who said they would rather fall asleep in their own homes than wake up somewhere strange. One of those who stayed was a woman named Ludmila. She had collapsed twice. She had spent a combined total of 8 days unconscious in the local clinic. When a journalist asked her why she wouldn't leave, she said something that the journalist later said he could not stop thinking about. She said, "The sleep isn't bad. It's the waking up that's hard." The journalist asked what she meant. She looked out her window at the flat steppe for a moment. Then she said that during the sleep, she always felt completely at peace, more peaceful than she ever felt awake. She said she was not afraid of it. She said she thought maybe the village was trying to tell people something, and that most people were too frightened to listen. The journalist wrote that down and moved on to his next question. But I keep coming back to it, because here is what I find most interesting about the story of Kalachi. Not the mystery of the gas, which may or may not have been the cause. Not the hallucinations, though they are extraordinary. Not even the fact that a quarter of a village collapsed repeatedly over 5 years without a definitive scientific explanation ever being confirmed. What I keep thinking about is this. In every account, from every person who experienced the sleep, the overwhelming description of the experience itself is not terror. It is peace. A deep, complete, absolute peace of a kind they had never felt while awake. A sense of returning somewhere, of rest that goes all the way down. And this is where the story stops being about Kazakhstan and starts being about something else. There is a theory in neuroscience, not a fringe theory, but one discussed in serious academic circles, that the brain, in certain extreme states, releases compounds that produce experiences of profound peace and transcendence. Dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, is one of them, produced naturally in the human brain and found in trace amounts in the body at all times, with elevated levels reported in near-death experiences and certain deep sleep states. Researchers studying people who have had these experiences describe a consistency that is difficult to explain by chance. The same qualities of light, the same sense of presence, the same feeling of coming home to somewhere that feels more real than ordinary life. The residents of Kalachi described all of these things. None of them had heard of DMT. Most of them were pensioners in a small Kazakh village with no internet access. The last documented sleeping episode in Kalachi occurred in 2015, after most residents had been relocated. A man who had stayed behind fell asleep alone in his house and was found by a neighbor 2 days later, still breathing, impossible to wake. When he came around, he sat up slowly, looked at the neighbor, and said, "I saw my wife." His wife had died 4 years earlier. He said she looked well. He said she told him not to worry. He said the place she was in was very quiet and very warm, like sitting beside a fire that never goes out. Then he asked for some tea because he was very thirsty. The neighbor made him tea. They sat together in the quiet house for a while without saying much. Outside, the steppe was flat and wide and empty in every direction, and the old mine sat 2 kilometers away in the dry grass, still sealed, still slowly breathing. "Sleep well."